A part of political science that's always fascinated me is the entire concept of political parties and how different political party systems work. Because you have countries like Italy, Israel, or France that have very weak party systems. And you'll often have parties collapse and reform or split, and all kinds of stuff like that happen. And very often the parties don't last particularly long. Then you'll have countries like the United Kingdom, Canada, United States, wherein you'll have the same few political parties that will survive for literally centuries and continue to dominate the political landscape to this day. And I just find it interesting how wide a range you have between different countries that all allegedly have what I would call competitive elections. And so I started thinking to myself, maybe I could like come up with a formula and take a look at this in a more kind of empirical or quantitative manner. And I could try to see how powerful different political parties are, how dominant they've been over time, and to just kind of try to look at a bunch of the major political forces that have shaped our world. So this is Political Party Strength, a look at the most dominant parties in history. So just a couple short notes. This is was very difficult to find information on, and once you see my formula, you'll see why. I had to rely on ChatGPT and Copilot a lot for this. If it looked weird, I would go in and manually check it to just see if it was on, and I would sometimes ask Copilot to confirm ChatGPT and the like. But some things I just couldn't really find, or would have taken an extremely long amount of time to go through and get, particularly for so many. For one or two cases, given the concept of liberal conservative and conservative liberal, they are not exactly the same thing. So I just use the term right liberal to cover both. And just the various countries and political parties is supposed to be kind of a compromise between how I would characterize the particular parties and how mainstream political science was, or rather does. So if something here seems out of line with something I've said in the past, I'm trying to kind of do a compromise and find a happy medium. So let's start off and look at the formula that I came up with. So the political party strength, I tried to take a bunch of different factors so that they would kind of balance each other out. And I think once you get into the actual list and the scores countries got, it worked pretty well. So, firstly, I gave them 1 point for each decade of existence. I think that that's fair. Some parties have been around nearly 200 years, whereas others have been around for maybe 10 years. And I don't think it's fair, like, to give a party, even if it does extremely well, something like New Ideas in El Salvador. Sure, it might get 80% of the vote, but it's only run in 2 elections. So could you really compare that to something like the Republican Party, which has been around since the 1850s? And that just allows, that also adjusts for parties that have stayed in the game and go through periods of ups and downs. Okay, then I gave them 1 point for each electoral win. This depends a bit on the country. Generally speaking, if it's a presidential system, this is presidential election wins. If this is a parliamentary system, this is parliamentary election wins. This also includes coalitions that they lead. We have win percentage. I picked 20. I tried a couple different numbers. That seemed reasonable to me. And I kind of tweaked that in the next one until I thought it gave a decent balance. So, win percentage is the number of elections it took part in. What percentage of them did it win? Once again, this depends on the system in a particular country, and in some cases, I made some adjustments. Like, for instance, when it comes to United Russia, Putin technically ran as an independent, but for the sake of this calculation, I'll count him and stuff like that. The last one is really what I needed ChatGPT for, and this is the average vote share. So this is if you were to take all the major elections they ran in and you were to average out their percentage of the popular vote, what would that be? And then they get a score of 20 points for that. So the idea here is win percent. It's I'm trying to kind of adjust for the particulars of a different electoral system. So in first past the post, you can win elections with like 30% of the vote and still get a majority, depending upon where your support is and how many opposition parties there were, but then you'll score very low under average vote share. Likewise, you can do very well in average vote share. Like in Canada, the Conservatives in the last couple elections have done much better than the Liberals. Or not much better, but they've done better than the Liberals in terms of their share of the popular vote. But because their vote is not very efficiently distributed, it doesn't yield nearly as many seats. And then I also put in a -4 points for the number of times refounded. So this is the number of times there's been major merges, or they've changed their name, or they've rebranded, or they've reorganized themselves. This happens to certain parties. In particular, I'm thinking of countries like France, where you have like a center-right Gaullist party, but it rebrands itself every other week. And I don't think it's really fair to count those all as one party. Like I'm not going to count the Whigs as part of the Republican Party, or rather, if I was going to, I think there should be a penalty for that, given that the actual party mechanism of the Whig Party dissolved itself and most of its members joined the Republicans. So before we get into the top 10, I wanted to take a look at just a whole bunch of parties you might know that have not made it into the top 10. So we have a lot of variety here. So at the kind of the tail end, we have AfD and the National Front. They basically only got points for the duration that they've been in existence and their percent of the popular vote. They haven't actually won any major elections. But like I said, if you look at some other parties in France, like the Gaullist parties, that's just all of the ones post-World War II combined. Even though they've won a number of elections, they keep being refounded. The French Socialist Party is kind of low. The Brazilian Workers' Party tends to win, at least under Lula. But I think its actual existence is not super long. And Brazil's electoral system is extremely fractured. So then we go along and we have some other parties. The Austrian People's Party is pretty decent. They keep swapping power with the Social Democrats. We have the KMT. Parties like the KMT are kind of hard because you have a period where there was one party rule, and then you have a period where there's multi-party rule, and we'll talk a bit about how I adjusted for that once we get to some of those parties. And then we just kind of have some other ones like the Judicialist Party in Argentina, New Ideas in El Salvador, which wound up doing really well despite being around for such a short period of time, because it got basically 100% in both of these categories. But I think this makes sense because I'm balancing it off against the fact that it's not very old. You have Likud, you have United Russia, FNFL. Now, Likud is probably somewhat inflated just because of how often Israel has elections, and they can rack up a whole bunch of points. And then at the end, we have the Canadian Conservative Party. The only reason it did not make the top 10 is because it's being refounded twice. First, it went from being just the Conservative Party to being the Progressive Conservative Party, and then to the Conservative Party of Canada. So it lost about 8 points there. So let's look at a couple honorable mentions before we get on to our top 10. So the honorable mentions are here because I wasn't really sure how to score them. When you have parties like the PRI, for most of its history, Mexico didn't have competitive elections. The elections were rigged, so can you really say it's dominant under that scenario? So what I did for some of these is I either will have a since competitive elections, and I'll have both, or in cases like this, I'll just do it as kind of an asterisk score. So the PRI was founded after the Mexican Revolution as a way of institutionalizing its gains. Therefore, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which I just kind of find a a funny term because it is kind of an oxymoron. So it's a party that's gone all over the place ideologically over the 20th century. It was initially more of kind of a social democratic party, but now it's become kind of neoliberal or civic nationalist. Uh, More so, and you'll see this with some of the parties in non-democratic countries. It's a lot more based on patronage and who you know in the party rather than any kind of ideological conviction. So that's the Institutional Revolutionary Party. It's fallen on hard times, and it's not really competitive anymore. Okay, we have the ANC. The ANC, as with some parties, suffers from not being around very long. Now, this one was a little tricky because it was technically founded like very early in the 19th century, but 20th century, but because it didn't really compete in elections until 1994, I didn't want to give it too many points for the like decades that it was just kind of on the sidelines. So I decided to start its counter in 1994. It is in the honorable mention category because honestly, it's not that high on the list because, like I said, it's hasn't been around that long, and South Africa hasn't had that many elections. But also, I don't consider South Africa to be a democratic country. I know that they got a minority in the last election, but I'd argue even if they do have competitive elections today, I would say they probably did not have them for most of its history. So they were a left wing party. They used to be, I think, more radically left wing, but the extreme left of the party, the ANC Youth League, formed the Economic Freedom Fighters, and I forget what the other part of the ANC that defected was, but Jacob Zuma led a group of it, which is kind of like a socially conservative, economically socialist third party. So the ANC is not quite as radical as it once was, but it's still I'd say it's one of the few parties in Africa I'd actually say is black nationalist. Like not just African nationalist or Pan-African nationalist, but explicitly racial in its outlook. We have the MPLA, or the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola. This was a communist party that was founded during the Portuguese Wars of Independence, or however you want to refer to it as. Angola had one of, if not the world's longest civil war between them and UNITA. And as with a couple parties on this list, they're one of the ones that a lot of the communist parties post 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union survived, and some of them just renamed themselves or rebranded themselves. Like the Cambodian People's Party went from being a communist party to being a conservative party, or just became this like non-ideological patronage machine like in Ethiopia. But a lot of them stuck around. So for this one, I did the first semi-competitive election in 1992. So if we go through, it's been around a long time, but Angola hasn't had very many competitive elections. With a couple more, they could be getting up into the top 10. But as a lot of this stuff happened when the country was a one-party state, I don't think it's fair. And then the last one I wanted to take a look at is the Party of the Revolution in Tanzania. This was the party founded by Julius Nyerere. Now this is actually something I'd like to do a separate video on at some point if I ever get around to reading a book on it. Julius Nyerere was a very devout Catholic, and he developed his variant of African socialism called Ujamaa, which is very heavily influenced by Catholic social teaching. And there was just a lot of unique aspects to it. They eventually kind of abandoned it, and now they're just kind of a more normal socialist party. But I just thought I'd include them because they were interesting, and they're one of the stronger parties on this list. Okay, so let's get into the top 10. We've waited long enough. Number 10, the Colorado Party in Paraguay. No relation to the state. So this one is at number 10 because it could either be at number 1 or it could not even be on this list at all because it goes through periods. Paraguay periodically goes through periods of one party rule with the Colorado party, but when the country went back to having competitive elections, they continued to dominate. So, like I said, I had two separate scores. I think there was some competitive elections before, in between periods of one party rule, but I decided to include one since the founding, how well they performed, and after the return to multi party rule, how well they've done in the time since. So, as you can see, they have a very healthy score just going from 1989. But if we were to start going through the entire history of Paraguay, they're extremely dominant and one of the most dominant parties in the world. Now, you're going to see this quite a bit, but it seems like the most successful parties are often center right ones that are big tent. So, parties that kind of try to merge together or be a coalition of the different right wing aspects in society. So, like conservatives, nationalists, Christian Democrats, right liberals, all those people. A number of parties on this list tend to be big tent. Conservative parties and the Colorado Party would be one of them. As with some of the other parties on this list, though, ideology is kind of secondary to the fact that it's been in power so long and it has so many ties to various corporations and government institutions that it's kind of, you have to be a member of it, kind of like with the LDP to a certain extent, or the Communist Party of China, to really get anything done, to get your permits approved. It just has such a strong hold over Paraguayan society that the patronage network alone is super important. Okay, we have the coalition in Australia. You might say this is a bit of a stretch because the coalition is actually two parties. So the coalition is made up of the Liberal Party and the National Party. And if you start going through the various states, you get all these weird mixtures of the two, like the Liberal National Party or the Country Party or something like that. Basically, the Liberal Party is the more urbanized version, and the National Party is the more agrarian, rural version. So, once again, as with a lot of different parties on this list, you have a big tent center right party that is able. Maybe it's just that right wing parties are more capable of containing a coalition of diverse interess than it comes with left wing parties. Because I know that's the case in Canada, where we have one major conservative party, however you feel about them. And then we have like the Liberal Party, the New Democrats, the Green Party, arguably the BQ, all on the left of the political spectrum. For whatever reason, it just seems in a lot of cases it's easier to have a big tent conservative party than it is to really have a big tent socialist party. So I think that that's accurate. I checked a couple different sources. They have had a very high win percentage over time, and it's only really recently that the elections have started to get more competitive, and is kind of taking a similar number of electoral victories. It does suffer one refounding because they reformed from the Australia Party to the Liberal Party, and I think the Nationals used to be known as the Country Party. So they did go through one partial refounding, I think in the 1920s, but other than that, exceedingly successful party. Okay, next, and I'm sure a lot of people were expecting this one to make the list, the People's Action Party of Singapore, or the PAP. This has been the dominant political party in Singapore since the country first became independent from Malaysia. Most notably, it was founded and led for decades by Lee Kuan Yew, and it's seen Singapore become one of the wealthiest countries in the world per capita, definitely one of the most efficiently run, and with my understanding, having a very low amount of crime. So it was initially founded as like a social democratic party, my understanding is, and used to be part of Socialist International, which is kind of funny given where things went. So broadly speaking, the People's Action Party is kind of the epitome of a party of pragmatism and order. This is roughly where it sits on the political spectrum in center to center right. Generally speaking, it pursues socially conservative law and order policies. Developmentalism in an Asian context, that's where you have the state involved in market development through things like tariffs, infrastructure, monetary policy, things like that, where you have active cooperation between government and industry. The Liberal Democratic Party of Japan is another example of this. And it was also successfully implemented in South Korea, if memory serves. And their big focus is technocracy. Singapore puts a big focus on just basically competent, non corrupt government. My understanding is in Singapore, civil servants are paid similar to how they are in how a similar position would be in the private sector, but there's very high expectations on them, and it's extremely brutal if they're caught embezzling money or any sort of corruption. By and large, it runs on just very scientific managerial principles. My understanding is Singapore is more or less like the poster child of where the trains run on time. Now, people debate sometimes whether or not Singapore is a democracy. My understanding is it is, and that there isn't formal repression of opposition parties. It's just that the PAP has consistently delivered and continues to deliver. And the country is one of the wealthiest places on earth with low crime, low corruption, and things are just going well. So people don't really see any reason to vote them out of office, because why would you turn the country over to a socialist party and roll the dice on that one? Also, obviously, they probably have huge patronage networks, a lot of influence in the media. None of this may necessarily be nefarious, but if you've been in power that long, these things tend to come up. I remember when we had the recent election in Singapore, I was looking at it, and because it's so dominant, they had to create set aside seats for the opposition so that there would be some opposition in their parliament, because the PAP was just winning every single seat, and they wanted to have some diversity of ideas. So once again, the only reason this is not higher is it is fairly recent at 1954, and some countries here are parties here are well over 100 years old. But if it continues on for another decade or two, it's quite likely this one could reach the top. Okay, next we have the Independence Party in Iceland. Surprisingly, this is about 100 years old and dates back to before Iceland was a fully independent country. So this is the main center-right party in Iceland. I referred to it as liberal conservative because I doubt it's particularly conservative as we understand it, given that it's Iceland. My understanding is it's fairly economically liberal. The Independence Party, I think it initially referred to independence from Denmark, but kind of the funny thing is it now kind of has independence from the EU. It is Eurosceptic. Iceland is not part of the EU. And there's a lot of opposition to joining the EU there. There's actually a fairly substantial, I guess you could say, sovereigntist movement in Iceland, but it also tends to be very Atlanticist. Iceland's kind of a unique place. I'm not super familiar with it, but it might be interesting to take a look at some point in the future. Basically, Iceland has more than two major parties. So, from my understanding, the Independence Party generally just wins enough of the popular vote in enough seats that it can form a coalition with some of the other liberal or centrist parties. Okay, next, another one that I'm sure a lot of people were expecting, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan. So it was founded in 1955 by a merger of the Liberal Party and the Democratic Party, and it's basically ruled Japan ever since. I believe that they've only lost two elections since 1955. I think it was 1991 or something like that, that they temporarily lost, and there was a bunch of stuff, and then they eventually regained power. And they lost an election, I think it was 2011, as a result of the fiscal crisis. And they currently have a minority government, but they pretty consistently, I think, remain the largest party. Except for a couple years here or there. and they pretty consistently get about 40 to 45% of the vote. And given that Japan is not a two-party system, that's normally enough that they can form government, especially with their allies in, I think it's pronounced Nukamito, the Buddhist Democracy Party. So they are a big tent party. I put them as right wing as opposed to center right because I think they're a lot more tolerant of what we would consider right wing to far right ideas. Like if you're a nationalist or a like a paleo, I don't know if paleo conservative would be the right term, but like you're a reactionary, you're a World War II revisionist, you support the idea that the emperor is a god. Generally speaking, I think that is accepted within the Liberal Democratic Party, and they don't have quite the same tradition of calling anyone who is slightly to the right of the party leader some sort of neo Nazi. But because it's been around so long, and it is very much a big tent, kind of like United Russia, it's a union of most of the right wing parties in Japan. Now, this is fact forces in Japan. Now, this has changed a bit where you have like the Democratic Party for the People, which is like the moderate wing that's split off, and you have a couple far right parties like the Japanese Conservative Party. But generally speaking, it remains the main force of the Japanese right. So I put down national conservatism because I think that that's broadly speaking the majority ideological basis. They tend to be a party very focused on economic growth, social stability, Japanese sovereignty, opposition to immigration, and generally speaking, conservative social values. Much like the People's Action Party, they increasingly have grown to favor technocracy, that is, direct ties with the bureaucracy, direct ties with various corporations. There's a lot of corruption scandals that wind up happening with the LDP, and it maintains a massive patronage network. I put down as factions as you have, like I said, it's a big tent right wing party, so you have people ranging from like liberal conservative or conservative liberals to reactionaries to right wing nationalists. Like Shinzo Abe was the right wing of the party. I think the current leader, whose name escapes me, is more of the center of the party. And then there's kind of a left wing of the party. However, it's generally speaking broadly conservative, but more generally concerned with social stability and keeping Japan's economy going. Once again, this is a party that would probably be closer to the top if it's around for another decade or two. It's just 1955, well, it seems like a long time compared to the next couple, is not that recent. It's not that old. Okay, so we have the Liberal Party of Canada. One of the two main political parties in Canada going back to before the country even existed, back when it was Parti Rouge. In Quebec, at least, it's more or less dominated Canadian politics for the majority of its existence, especially given the multiple times the Conservative Party has rebranded itself or collapsed. It's commonly called the Natural Governing Party of Canada, and as my former boss put it, they probably have the strongest political brand of any political party in the Western world, other than maybe like the CDU, although that's not really the case anymore. But they just have a very stable brand that's very heavily tied to Canadian civic nationalism, welfare, equality, diversity, all those kind of things. So the Liberal Party has kind of gone all over the place with regards to ideology. At some points, it was more socialistic, I believe, under Trudeau 1. During the 1990s, under Chrétien, it became more of a neoliberal party that cut spending a lot and managed to actually reduce the deficit. I think it actually had a balanced budget for a couple of years there. But much as with the Conservative Party, it's kind of been all over the place. I put down social liberalism. Social liberalism is kind of an in between social democracy and classical liberalism. I think is probably the best way to put it. They are very much a neoliberal party supporting globalization. I put down Canadian federalism because while the Conservative Party is also federalist, people tend to associate the Liberal Party with trying to centralize the country, preventing provinces from gaining too much power, and trying to build up national institutions at the expense of the provinces, and also being the arch nemesis of Quebec separatism. A reminder that the Conservative Party was 49. So they outscored them by quite a bit. Even if you remove the penalties for being refounded, they would still be substantially higher than the Conservative Party. As a side note, I almost view politics in Canada, at least before maybe like the 1980s or so, as being more identitarian in a lot of ways, wherein Catholics voted liberal and Francophones voted liberal, whereas Anglos and Protestants tended to vote more conservative. It also very much depends on the part of the country, where certain parts reliably vote liberal and certain parts reliably vote conservative. And in many cases, that was more important than the exact ideologies involved. Okay, so we're heading into the final four, and I think at least three of these people have probably guessed by this point. Okay, so we have the Democratic Party of the United States, founded in 1828. Now, some people would say that this was founded by Jefferson with the Democratic Republican Party. I just decided, because it split in half and we had all the shenanigans with the National Republican Party and then you had the Whigs and stuff like that, I just went with what people will often say and go with Andrew Jackson founding the party in 1928, which makes it one of the oldest political parties in the world. I think it might actually be the oldest, at least in terms of like one that's consistently been competitive. Very close to 200 years at this point in time. Now, the Democrats have been all over the place depending on the era. I think it's important to keep in mind it's hard to map 19th century politics onto the 20th or 21st century, just because there's a lot of issues like slavery or the franchise or female suffrage or the role of government that just aren't really debated topics anymore. So it's gone through a number of iterations. My understanding is the Democrats had always been very divided between the southern and northern wing of their party, with the southern wing generally speaking being conservative. Maybe you could even say like socially conservative, kind of economically liberal. And with the civil rights movement and the big realignment, the conservative faction broke off of the Democratic Party and joined the Republican Party, which made it a much more kind of consistently conservative party. Whereas I'd say it was kind of like a liberal conservative or national liberal party prior to that point. Now, I'm just going to say when we get to another party on this list, you may be wondering, how is this 55% if the other one is also over 50%? The Democrats ran a number of elections prior to the other party on this list being founded that they won, which are included, so you kind of get a weird score. Once again, this might be somewhat inaccurate. I use ChatGPT for this, but it's kind of all over the place. If the vote share looks very low, you have to keep in mind that this is an average of like 200 years. And this includes the time when America was basically a one-party state during Reconstruction, and the massive landslides that were won by Reagan and Nixon, although FDR obviously won a number of them himself. So at 63%, the Democratic Party is in the top four most successful political parties of all time. Next, we have the Conservative Party, formerly known as the Conservative and Unionist Party. I had actually thought that this one was going to be number one, but it being number three is pretty close. So the Conservative Party was founded by, I think it was Robert Peel, in 1834 out of the remains of the Tory Party, if it was ever formally a party, and we still use the term Tories in most, at least in Canada and the UK, to refer to members of the Conservative Party. And if the Liberal Party of Canada is the natural governing party of Canada, then the Conservative Party can be said to be the natural governing party of the United Kingdom, or at least prior to the 1990s, where it kind of lost a lot of its steam because of the aftermath of the Thatcher era and Blair and stuff like that, but we don't need to go into that at the moment. So its ideology is, generally speaking, being conservatism and British unionism, hence why it has unionist in its name. I added in neoliberalism because I think post Thatcher that was very much the case, but it's gone through like a lot of different variations over the years. Under Disraeli, you had one nation conservatism, which kind of reminds me a bit of integralism or like a more traditionalist conservatism. You've had more neoliberalism, you've had more protectionism. It's kind of just been all over the place with regards to the conservatives. Generally speaking, they've represented the center right of British society, and they've been pretty stable in that regard until very recently. Whereas the left has periodically fractured, and you've had like the Labour Party replace the Liberal Party, and then you had like the Liberal Democrats, however you wanted to define them, make their comeback. They've always been a consistently powerful force in British politics, and while the time may have come that they have seen their final end, and some other right-wing party will emerge to take their place, it's hard to say. Who knows what the future can be? They've been through some rough patches before, and it remains to be seen if they'll bounce back. Okay, so number 2, and once again, I'm sure a lot of people have guessed this one. The Republican Party. Now, keep in mind that Democrats, Conservative Party, and Republican Party were all tied. Once again, they probably aren't tied, and I probably screwed this up somewhat, but it is what it is. I think this list is, broadly speaking, mostly accurate. So the Republican Party was founded in 1854 out of the remnants of, I believe it was the Free Soil Party, the America Party, or the Know Nothing Party, and primarily the Whig Party, specifically the northern wing of it. Based on an anti-slavery platform, but also espousing modernization, industrialization, tariffs, and federal improvements. The foundation of the party and the election of its leader, Abraham Lincoln, was one of the major causes of the Civil War. Now, part of the reason why the electoral wins are so high, and I don't know if there should be an asterisk next to this, but after the events of the Civil War, the South was placed under military occupation for a prolonged period of time, and Southern whites were not allowed to vote. Carpetbaggers, that is, Northerners who moved to the South, were able to vote, and blacks were able to vote, and they tended to vote Republican. So you had a time period where they were basically running largely unopposed, which really padded this. But the Republican Party has also produced some of the most popular presidents in American history: Eisenhower, Reagan, Theodore Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, and I could go on. Keep in mind, once again, this is vote share in presidential elections. My understanding is the Republicans, I think in general, tend to do better in presidential elections than congressional elections, although that changed with the Republican Revolution. It's all very complicated. We don't need to go into too much detail. So the Republican Party, I would say, is traditionally was a liberal conservative or conservative liberal party, or a national liberal party as I describe it. Nowadays, it is a true big tent right-wing party. So this will include everything from libertarians to classical liberals to social conservatives and the Christian right. More recently, we have American nationalists and right-wing populists, but also a substantial neoconservative wing that was dominant for many years. And you have all these different groups, and the Democratic Party, as with the Republican Party, has a number of different factions or study groups within it, like the Freedom Caucus, for example, that kind of represent the different ideological strains within the big tent. So that is the Republican Party. Now, I want you to pause the video and put down in the comments section what you think number 1 would be. Because I actually was not expecting what number 1 was, but it made perfect sense once I looked at it again. Okay, so now that you've put it down, let's take a look. The number 1 most successful party in history, according to my scoring system, is the Swedish Social Democratic Party. Now, once again, this kind of took me by surprise. It was something I hadn't really expected or thought about. But then I started kind of getting into it. I'm like, yeah, you know what? That does actually make a lot of sense. So the Social Democrats in Sweden have dominated the party basically since the late 19th century. I mean, if we look at their win percentage, they've won 77% of elections for well over 100 years, governing the country just for extremely long periods of time, and consistently getting a very high share of the popular vote, especially considering that Sweden is not a two party system. While the Social Democrats have declined a little bit in recent years due to various further left wing components breaking off, they're still the largest party in Sweden. However, like I said, they've been in a decline, and they've kind of gone from the period where they could reliably expect at least 40% of the vote to now getting about 30%. However, I think the next largest party, which at the moment is the Swedish Democrats, gets like 20% or so in election. So it's still quite a bit higher, and they will probably remain the leading party in Sweden for the foreseeable future. And so that is our political party list. I think what we found is pretty much all of these were big tent parties. I mean, which makes sense. If you're going to survive for a long time, it's hard to be super committed to any particular ideology. It's also notable that a lot of these parties come from countries that have a first past the post electoral system, although not all of them, as that tends to result in there being a stable majority if you can get a decent plurality of the vote. I think on the whole, though, something to just keep in mind is a lot of these parties, I think, have stayed strong because they've been able to deliver results. Most of the countries that we looked at here developed enormously over the duration of these parties' existences. Even if they weren't always in power, they were in power for substantial lengths of time. The Liberal Democratic Party in Japan, regardless of what it is nowadays, is forever associated with the great economic miracle post World War II and decades of stability and growth. Likewise, the Liberal Party of Canada is strongly associated with Canada becoming fully independent from the United Kingdom and becoming a major player on the world stage in its own right, and as the one party that developed the Canadian identity. Once again, you also had the Democratic Party, which brought in the New Deal and the various stuff that Johnson brought in, regardless of how you feel about it. That was a big, iconic, society-changing pack of legislation. And the Conservative Party led the United Kingdom through much of the Cold War and obviously throughout World War II. So, I hope that you found that interesting. If you like more videos like this, please leave a comment below. Let me know what else you would like to see going forward. There should be a link to my Patreon. Please pledge there if you want to keep supporting these videos. They take quite a bit of work to do. I enjoy doing them, but a little bit of compensation would also be nice. So, God bless everybody. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you again real soon.